We hope you enjoy listening to the historic gathering of the Willaura community, a 2-day event recorded in 2015 called The Yarn. Listeners are to be advised that these recordings contain voices and images of family members, community and friends who have died. Yesterday was an amazing day. So we had some great stories shared. Some residents had come that had moved away from the area and have also gone back yesterday. So we did have a lot of recording time yesterday and some wonderful yarn. Today we wanted to really focus on part of the great thing that's happened with Heather and me pulling this together is we got support by the Glenelg Hopkins CMA, citing that the stories of the place and the evolution of how practices and changes have happened in the land really come from our stories, really comes from the relationship that our community and our families have in relationship to country and relationship to land. And so part of looking towards the future and understanding how as communities and maybe even as a species of human beings, how we are kind of going to evolve into the future, it's important that we grab as many of the stories that we can of our time, which will inform the future generations. And so we really value any input this morning, which will be around farming practices and the evolution and the changes in farming practices and our waterways and our animals and lots of different things from that point of view. I'd invite any feedback if there's something that stands out that we should add to that list. Immigration. So who would like to commence a yarn about life on the land? Don't be shy. Looks like it's going to be Dad.
Yeah, that's really caught me on the hop. Where do I start? Jeff Spittle. I came to Willaura as a young child in the late 1940s, and we took up a soldier settlement farm at Willaura, Wycliffe, on the Willaura-Wycliffe Road, probably a bit nearer Wycliffe. We've seen a lot of changes, farming practices. I think when we first came home from school, we had the stooking of the sheaf hay and the using of binders. We were after the horse-drawn stuff, but I'm sure someone here can probably go back to that stage. Cropping-wise, we used to plough the paddocks up with a mildboard plough, harrow the ground, work the ground up, and as we know today, destroy the soil structure. Later farming practices, of today, is direct drilling, use of chemicals. The direct drilling doesn't disturb the soil structure, and we find that's much better for the environment. Back probably around 20 years ago, land care came into operation. The majority of farmers around here started planting trees, perhaps to stop erosion, etc. I remember probably with one of the droughts back in the 70s, we had terrible dust storms around here. We had one particular hill paddock in crop. I reckon the wind removed about 6 or 8 inches of topsoil from the land, and that's still, that can't be replaced. So again, going back to our direct drilling, that sort of helps our environment. And the planting of trees in strategic locations also broke the wind and helped with the environment. When we first came there were open gullies and things, and over the years we saw these gullies erode very quickly. Again, back around 20 years ago, we started to fill the head of these gullies in, divert the water around so they wouldn't cause further erosion, and plant these gullies or streamlines out with trees. Walking through that area today after 20 odd years, help with the environment along those creek lines. Also the barrier probably helps eliminate superphosphate from going into the waterways and finishing up in the Hopkins River in my case. Creates that buffer zone.
I'm going to take it just back a little bit to what you remember as kids working on farms, the boys and the girls working on farms. So some of the things that used to happen, or some of your jobs when you were little kids working with your mums and dads on the farm, who'd like to speak of that?
That's very kind of you, Luke. Rolly Patterson. Well, I was a city boy, so you probably picked the wrong person, but we used to come up to my uncle's farm where we are now regularly, and as a 8 and 12-year-old, we used to just take his old FJ ute and go driving.
Damien Phillips, Spittles Road, Willaura. When I left school in 1962, my father had a dairy. We used to milk 25 cows, and was it the procedure? We used to have to separate the cream and used to go to our butter factory, and in the springtime we used to get up to 100 gallons of cream a week, and after a while the our butter factory closed down, and then we used to just have to store the cream once a week. We used to go down to Bungaree. And while I'm at it, I'll tell you a story about the snakes. We leased Greenvale off Peter Bingley's father for 10 years, and the river flat up the top end used to be in the 70s, used to get 2 or 3 floods a year, nearly guarantee it, grand final time in Minnanera League. And most people used to have to go way down to Yorick Road to get over the Hopkins River. One year we had a flood in January, and of course it knocked all that back Bolac boundary fence down. We left it for about 2 or 3 weeks. Anyway, we went along to stand up the fence, and of course it's full of reeds and everything. We started pulling the reeds and rubbish off with our hands. Within half an hour we had 1 snake. Anyway, we decided we'd better go home and get pitchforks. And it took us 2 or 3 days, and after a while you could hear the snakes whispering to each other. And within 3 days we cleaned up 52 snakes. And we relocated the whole lot of them. And that was the procedure that used to go on. You used to have to wash the river flat in flood times and get the cattle and the sheep off. We had 2 or 3 days in advance if it was flooding up at Denical Creek. So, and of course, what's happened since, there's hardly ever been a flood down there, except in 2011, I'm on the adjacent property and there was billabongs and so forth. I've never seen water in it, but 2011 January, when we had 11 inches, everything was full, and the first time I've ever seen the water out of the river banks in my property. So that's what has happened. I often wonder, the last 3 or 4 years, the river has dried up, and even cows go and carve in the bottom of it. So that's what's happened in the Hopkins River.
Jeff Gallett. I've been a resident of Willaura all my life. When I think back onto our childhood days, the hardest work I can remember is carting square bales of hay. And I look around the room and I see Graham Robbie over there, and I know he was out professional hay carting at one time, and everybody else, and boy, that's the hardest work I think I've ever done on the farm. And it was normally done in 40-degree heat under an corrugated iron roof, and you'd load the truck out in the paddock, and you'd hope the load would make it back to the hay shed, and then you'd go through your various stacking processes. We had tried all different methods of stacking and different layouts, and you'd look at the haystacks a few months later and you'd see them starting to bulge and think, oh, well, have to try a different technique next year. But just handling bales and those bales and that sort of physical work, you'd aim for about 1,000 bales a day or whatever, a couple of you. And so and we look at the way hay's handled today, and you look at the young fellas doing it and you think, boy, they're getting it easy compared to how we knew it. But if we were to turn the clock back further and you'd go back to sheaves, and those people handling sheaves would have been looking at the square bales thinking, boy, how easy is that? So that's how progress goes.
Thanks, Jeff. I've got a question about draining Muirhead and the swamp and what created Lake Bunninjon and how that all happened. And I know there's an old bridge and a drain. Does anyone know much about that? Robert Lister? Draining the morass, sorry.
Robert probably knows more about it than me, but he's slipped a couple of little secrets to me. It was, Graham Robinson. The morass was drained way back at the turn of the century, and I believe one of the Dunsters was fairly opposed to the draining of it. Yeah, anyway, they wanted to drain it for the land, and there was a fair bit of controversy over it. And one of the landowners threatened to shoot the horses if it came outside the proclaimed area that the drain was going to go through. The old guy sat up there with the rifle the whole time that it was drained, and if the horse was going to stick its head out, he was going to shoot it. So it never happened, of course, but it was drained, and consequently all that mud and stuff like that wound up in Lake Bunninjon, which is silted up Lake Bunninjon like you wouldn't believe. I can remember many, many years ago when we were a young kid that it actually had a sort of a partially sandy bottom, and now it's absolutely full of black mud, and you could be sure that had come from the morass.
Thanks, Graham. Would anyone else like to add? What about some other farming stories?
My name's Robert Lister. I grew up here in Willaura till I was about 15, and then I left. Getting back to what Graham was saying about the morass, Bob Phillips, who was out Willaura North, I've got some actual photos, I should have brought them, of him, George Talbot, with his bullock team, actually building that drain, coming out of the morass, or cleaning it out. And Bob Phillips was, I think it was about the summer of 1938, I think it was, and he was telling me when he was still alive, he used to walk up there every morning from their property just near Free Chain Road, up Snake Road, to do that drain there, and he said he's never seen so many snakes. It'd be nothing like to see 100 snakes in a day all through that area because it's so swampy. But he was about 21, I think he said he was, on the end of the, and he used to hang on to the mud scoop behind the bullock team, and they used to clean the drain out, about that drain anyway, yeah. So, but getting back to hay carting, was Jeff was saying over there, yeah, well, I've done plenty of that too, and I blame Harold, my father, for my back. I reckon that's why my back's buggered, because I was out hay carting when I was only about 10 years old, and we used to, we carted thousands and thousands of bales. I know one time up at Beulah, we went up and carted hay up there for Moores at Horsham, and I was about 13 or 14, and we carted 63,000 bales of hay. You just go in a paddock and you see the lines, and they just never ever end. It was just, we were doing 2,000 a day, and stinking heat. It was just, shocking. But so that's one little thing I can remember around here as a kid. Dad used to do the garbage run around Willaura, if people remember. He started doing it in about 1965, I think it was. And he started off with his car and a trailer, and I used to drive the car actually, and old Merv Goodson, the copper, he knew, but he never used to say anything. We used to doing that around here, but had a little bit to do with the land around the place. As a kid growing up, got friends with different people, like the Prices out there, and the Huckers, and the Wheelers, and you're always out there after school, or on weekends you'd ride your push bike out, and you'd help them on the farm, feeding out sheep or doing some chores around there. So it was really good to grow up around that sort of era, and people probably agree Willaura was a very good place to grow up in back in them days, and you learn a lot around the town here. So another little, so there used to be a dairy out the road out here. I can't remember who used to own it, just out near Herb Albert, that's right. Yeah, I can remember riding your bike. We used to ride the bikes out there to take the billy over the handle and go out there and get the fresh milk and cream, then ride back home. And then sometimes call into the old bakery and get a loaf of bread to take home. By the time you got that home, you had a whole board from one end right through to the other.
Thanks, Robert. You mentioned fishing. Has anyone got some fishing and yabbying stories? Jeffrey's got one.
Damien Phillips again. I'm going to tell you a story about Jeffrey's father. He used to get Jeffrey and I to cart in the bags of oats. Anyway, we get 1 or 2 loads in the morning, and it was starting to get a little bit hot. Anyway, it was black and white TV was just out, and Ron always had this idea, you go and get the smoko. Well, Jeffrey and I unloaded the oats into the barn. One of these days it was about 100, well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Anyway, it was about 2 o'clock and we got back to the barn after the first load after dinner. And Ron went down and said, I'll go and get the smoko. Anyway, it wasn't smoko time, but anyway, we unloaded it. And he didn't bring the smoko back. Anyway, we went down the house and here's Ron sitting up watching the bloody Davis Cup on the telly. And that was the procedure. Anyway, you used to give him a hand to cart the bloody grass hay in. Anyway, we had to stack about 8 high on the truck, and Ron would start putting the bloody foot down because he'd look at the watch, and then he always only gave us half an hour to 3/4 an hour to put a load on. And Jeffrey yelled out, slow down. It only lasted a couple of minutes, and then he'd put the foot down again, and be driving over tops of bales and everything. And he'd get out and he said, you blokes take too long to put the hay on. And that was his procedure, and he always had everything done by the watch. That's the hay carting down to Spittles. We used to run over quite a few bales, long as it got in a hurry. That was all about it.
We do have Oliver Gellert here this morning, and would you like to have a chat on the microphone about anything you like? Perhaps we might ask you about some of your earliest memories and some of the really early stories that might be around, or whatever.
Yeah, my name's Oliver Gellert. I was born just across the other side of the Oval in 1940. I did all my primary schooling here in Willaura, and then went 1 year to Ararat High School. We then shifted to Glen Thompson, not very far away, but Ararat wasn't our primary shopping area. From then on, we went to Hamilton, and we now live in Hamilton. We lived about 1.5 miles towards Glen Thompson, and then that road that we used to call it Morgan's Road at that stage, but I think it's called Wedding Road now. And we lived just there near where Col Evans built on the other side of that road. You can still see the trees and things there. We left there in 1954 and went to Glen Thompson. Yeah, I can remember school days. Jimmy might have a story of that in a minute. Jim's my cousin. I'll let him tell that. But I can just remember when I was going to school here, after school every day we used to go up the street and get the Sun newspaper. It wasn't Herald Sun then, it was just the Sun. And we used to walk up to my grandmother's place in Warranook Street. Commercial, Warranook's the other one over further, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There was so many cars and people in the main street those days that you wouldn't be going to do anything. You wouldn't want to fire a 22 up the street or anything, you'd hit everybody. But just amazing the changes that take place. I don't know what else about the farming side of things a little bit there. I can remember Dad and my Uncle Phil carting sheaf hay. I used to drive the old Ford Blitz from stook to stook for them to throw it on, and then a year or two later it went into the square bales like Jeffrey was talking about, and boy, that was hard work, although I was a bit young to be doing it here, but when we got to Glen Thompson we had some hot days hay carting too.
What about the shift from, I suppose, the traditional ploughing techniques moving more into chemical farming and that transition that went on? When did that occur, and how did that go, and how, I suppose, was that? Who'd like to talk about that?
It's Chris Brain, Willaura, born in 54, and I guess I'm just starting to realise how old I am when I think I'm just sitting here beside George Brain. And we just had a few words with George, and he, back in the 30s, ran 8-horse teams. So he'd be one of the few left that actually worked horse teams. And George did that for many a year during the 30s. And here we are, so George, and we had Sid Gellert here yesterday at 94 or 5 years of age, him also in the horse days. And here we are today. We've come now to satellite farming, basically, in a living generation. So I think the transition's been just huge. When you think horses have been around for thousands of years and just in one generation into the satellite world, it's hard to imagine the next 50. Probably one of the earliest things I remember, I probably was starting on a Twin City tractor when I was about 14 years of age, and my father would put me on the back of a Twin City. There was no seat, it was standing, a hand clutch, a slasher behind it with a live PDO. This is when we had farm safety. And my father would say, whatever you do, don't get too close to that PDO shaft. No covers, and you'll be mowing clover paddocks. And there were bull holes in the clover, but you could never see a bull hole. And so the old Twin City would go along, next thing the front axle would fly up in the air, and you hung onto a steering wheel with grim life, because if you fell off, you were either tangled up in a PDO shaft or you were put onto a slasher. And I think we've come a long way. Thank you very much.
Anyone else to share there? Any of those old dangerous practices from those old days when we were lucky to not lose our lives?
Jack Donaldson. I'm now at the Wannon, the other side of Hamilton, but I came to Willaura as a 18-year-old from central Victoria and was used to 5 and 10 acre paddocks on our property, and when I got over here it was quite a revolution. I worked for Ken Laidlaw for about 4.5 years, which probably shaped the rest of my life, to be quite honest. It was a very enjoyable time over here, to be quite honest, but the farming practices, we were on the moldboard plough over here. I left central Victoria where we had a horse team, so to hop on a tractor was a bit different. But the advancement of farming, I don't know whether we're headed in the exact direction that I like now, but whether that proves to be right or wrong will remain to be seen. I mightn't live to see that day, but I'm not that wonderfully enthused with our chemical farming, but you know, that's up to the individuals. But yeah, it's been a very good experience. Certainly coming to Willaura was definitely the rudder of my life.
Thank you. We haven't heard from any of the women yet this morning. They don't have to be farming stories particularly, but did you go and help outside? What did you do? How did you do it? How did things change since you first came to the farms? Would anyone like to say anything about that?
Mandy Hurd. I've lived in Willaura most of my life. I think electricity made a great change to our way of living in the households. In the 50s, everyone was getting new mix masters, refrigerators. It was a great time, a time of hope. Yeah, I can remember Mum purchasing all those items, supposedly to make life easier. And going back to what Chris said about our childhood and the dangerous jobs we were given, I can remember one time, remember the weld mesh silos, and they had a huge auger. He used to put us kids on top and we'd have to push the grain down. I mean, I'd never do that with our children. It's amazing. I guess electricity changed all our lives. No, my great-great-grandparents settled at Mount Elliot, and the family still live on that farm. They knew nothing about farming. I don't know how farms survived back then. And I can remember my great-great-grandfather, he cultivated the hill, but he did it the wrong way and caused a lot of erosion. But they managed to survive, I don't know how, and become very productive farmers. Pretty amazing when you think about it. Yeah, you put me on the spot.
Thanks, Mandy. Anyone else got their hand up? Yes?
Merle Brain from Ararat now, was from Willaura for about 57, 58 years. I think one of the most advanced things for the wives of the farm was when perhaps shearing contractors decided that they wanted shearing quarters with a cook. And I think for most of the wives before that had to look after the family, fortunately I never had to do this because shearing quarters was built at our place the year before I got married, so I was lucky. But poor old mum, she had to rear the children, get them off to school, cook breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner at night for all the shearers as well. And I think they were really Trojans, those women. I don't know how they did it. And I know with Mandy electricity. First 12 months I was married, we didn't have electricity, which was a little bit of a shock, but I did have hot water through the stove. So we had a lamp that actually my parents had had before they got electricity on. It had 2 mantles and it burnt something the boys might remember called shellite. And you lit it and it gave quite a very good, light. But there was no electrical appliances for 12 months, and then everybody said, oh, wonderful. Instead of a kerosene fridge, you had an electric fridge, and you had your mix master, and you had your everything, you thought you had nothing to do. But apart from that, I think most of the wives around Willaura in my age group, not perhaps the parents, they had it tough, I think, but we had a wonderful life. Everything after the war started to boom. Wool was a good price, a pound a pound. So there was money in the pocket, but you still weren't allowed to spend it except on the farm. It came first, just the same. But we were starting all the different committees. We started the kindergarten and, you worked for the hospital and the guides and the brownies and the scouts and the cubs, and everybody was so busy the whole time. We played badminton here in the hall, and you'd take the children and they'd all have a wonderful time. So, I look back and I think it was the very best place to live, probably. And the people that are still here, living here, I'd say, stay here. It's still the best place to live, though I'm not here just at the moment. But that was other circumstances that caused that. So, no, that's about all I'd like to say. The school, unfortunately, like my children went to school, we had about 240 children there, and, school sports and all those sort of things. And a lot of things have changed in education, I think, especially in the primary schools. But apart from that, I just think, electricity, but I think when a lot of farmers say, the contractors just wanted a shearer's quarters and to put their own cook in because that's what the shearers wanted, I think most of the wives really blessed that. Teaching, well, I often think about this. I came here in about 1950 for 12 months as a brand new teacher out of college, full of all this psychology stuff and knowing nothing about children and think you know the lot and you get a hell of a shock. And then I came back in 54, got married and I gave up teaching. And then about 20 odd years later, I went back for 3 months to fill in for somebody that was going on maternity leave because the department didn't have anybody to send. And guess what? Those 3 months turned into nearly 20 years. It became a way of life. It was good though. Different atmosphere, I think, then. If I was head of the education department in government, the first thing I would say, nobody should be allowed to teach in a primary school until they have children of their own. Because you cannot understand how little children think, feel and react unless you've experienced it through being a parent. And that would be one thing I know they'd put a lot of teachers, but I think I'd stipulate that. I think that was, you learn so much, because when I went out first time, you think you know the lot and you know nothing. The second time I'd had 4 children, and I knew so much more on how to treat those little 5 and 6-year-olds and to understand how they were feeling and the things that upset them and encouraged them. And yes, so that'd be my big contribution to education if I could. Not allowed to teach in an infant department until you've had children of your own.
Karen Robertson. I married Graham and moved, I'd been in Willaura a few years before that, but I didn't really want to be here, so I didn't take much notice of what was happening in the town itself. Just before, Graham wants me to talk about hay carting, just before that I'd like to tell you about the Willaura Primary School. When our children went there, the Willaura Primary School was a very progressive school with very understanding teachers, and Merle was one of them. They pioneered visiting teacher service definitely in this district, and I suspect in the rural communities, visiting teachers for children with disabilities, and our 3 kids were allowed or were encouraged to stay here in Willaura because of the teachers taking extra classes in being able to instruct children with hearing difficulties and sight difficulties. And that allowed our 3 kids to actually stay in mainstream education. And thanks to the Willaura Primary School and later the schools in Ararat, they have achieved huge things in their lives, and we accredit it all to the Willaura staff at the primary school. Talking about hate carding, Graham, as Robert said, or someone else said, Jeff Gallett might have said, Graham started hate carding when he was about 14, I believe, and then he graduated to being a contractor at a very early age. When we were married, I could not cook. Graham used to have to kind of throw a meal together. Then he was carting hay basically at Yarram Park, and the biggest year we carted 120,000 square bales in about 4 weeks. He had 9 trucks and 27 workers. Those workers were mainly school kids or university kids who also didn't know how to cook. So I was landed with this job of looking after 27, 16 to 20-year-olds who needed 3 meals a day. That was a very, very steep learning curve. We used the shearing quarters at Yarram Park, so the kids could all stay there. We went through 2 crates of milk every lunchtime, and I would say 3 tins of Milo, because these were all kids. They weren't interested in drinking beer or anything. They wanted milk and Milo. We carted hay in very high temperatures, 30s and 40s degree days. Back in, I'm talking probably the early 1970s, it was quite common to have a cooked breakfast, a roast lunch, and usually I left a casserole or something for their tea. So they had 3 cooked meals a day. The only cooking facilities I had was a wood stove. So that was pretty exciting on a 40-degree day. Those kids were basically year 11 and 12 kids and university kids. Some of them came out to cart hay, and anyone who's carted square bales with the tight strings would understand this. These kids had soft hands, and I will never forget how many packets of Band-Aids I had to buy in a day for these kids to try and cart and I think each truck averaged about 1,000 to 200 to 1,200 bales of hay a day. But it was a pretty steep learning curve for a newly married lady.
I moved to Wandoo when I was 10, so I knew of Willaura, but I don't know it until yesterday. And also I haven't been listening because I'm half deaf, and I can't handle the echoing, so I don't know what's been said already. The theme of work we did as children, the first thing we had to do was clear our soldier settlement block of rabbits, because it was part of the one of the Jamison properties, and it was nothing much had been done except grazing. So we had to drag kerosene-soaked rags around burning tussocks, bring in a mob of a rabbit pack from one of the stations, lay 1080, and rip up the warrens, and we ate a lot of rabbit in those first weeks. What I don't know whether it has been touched on in these 2 days, and what I think is of most interest is the thousands of years of Indigenous history that preceded our couple of 100 years here, and I just wondered, everyone must, on their land, must have some stories or connection to what was going on here before we all arrived and kind of changed the landscape and led us towards climate change, partly. So I think we're really privileged to have Uncle Ted Lovett here, who is from this country, and I think it would be really interesting to hear Ted's childhood stories if he was willing to share them. But if not, whether people have stories from their ancestors on this country, like if they know what happened when their first settlers came. Or when I went to the high school at Lake Bolac, we had an art teacher, Miss Rance. Rance or Vance, I don't know if anyone knew her, but she did a drawing on my mum died recently, and I inherited the first school magazine, and on the cover was a drawing by Miss Vance or Rance of the Bullock as an Aboriginal man sitting, and she must have had some interest and maybe knowledge. And I know that there were several children came to the high school and were hounded out by racism. So I think there's a completely different story there, that more interesting.
Thanks, Jane. We'll go over to Robin.
Robin Biggin. I lived here from 1971 and left about 8 years ago. I'll just put the case for farmers' wives. I came to Willaura as a city girl and found Willaura a very vital and interesting town. For the first part of our marriage, we lived in town as our farm came down to the edge of the town, and I was on the edge of the farming work. I helped Ian when I needed to, and I had little children. His mother was the generation of a really farmer's wife who did everything, milked the cows. And I found when we moved into the original home, it was a pretty hard act to follow. Always lots of homemade cakes, big spreads for afternoon tea, and Sunday night was traditional sponges, cakes. Everywhere you went, it was take a plate, and it wasn't a competition, but yes, some people had their specialties. As time went on, I helped Ian outside. Probably a lot of women worked a lot harder, but you know, there were sheep to be drafted. We had lakes on our place. Every time you shifted sheep, I had to go with him as a second escort vehicle. A lot of dusty days in sheep yards, and he'd come home with something on the back of the truck, and they'd loaded it with a forklift and 5 fallows, but you just hold one end of that while I get it off. Lots of things like that. I remember a tank blowing across a paddock and halfway up Millier's Hill and having to reload that. A lot of good times, but a lot of hard work with it as well. And with farming, there's a lot of mental stress for everybody. You have bad years. Ian's pretty easy going, but sometimes I think I was the one that stressed. Someone mentioned you had a good year, and well, I'll get new lino in the kitchen. Oh no, we need 2 miles of fence. That was a lot more important, and that was tax deductible. It was a good life, and a good life for your kids. We had 2 girls, and they still love the farming life they grew up on. And our grandchildren, although they only visited until they were about 5 or 6, they still remember it fondly. Grandpa's farm, and they have a few acres just outside Ballarat, so they have a little pretend farm, as you would call it. A good life, but farmers' wives worked hard, and we also took up the slack with the children. Your children, we, like all of us, tried to give the opportunity to be involved with their sports and their guides and ballet lessons and piano lessons, and I was quite often cooking dinner at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because once you picked them up from school, you were on the road for 2 or 3 hours and you needed something to be there when you came home. And in those days, it was the women's work inside. Ian really wasn't awful about it, but you had your role, and that was more or less a support role. You kept the house going and he kept the outside going, and I kept the outside going too. But, you know, the roles didn't cross over quite as much as the next generation, as I see in my family. Anyway, it was a good life and we loved it, but farmers' wives are a really vital part of the support system, I think, for farmers, not just in a physical sense, but in a mental sense too, and I think that needs to be respected.
Thanks, Robin. Keith Dunster is here, and he might say a few words.
Yes, here I am. I am Keith Dunster from around. My parents were born all around, come from down up in Deep Lead back in 1912. They lived down at Belmont. There was 3 brothers. There was Hubert, Arthur and Harry. My father's name was Harry. They share farmed here on Egley for years. There was 16 share farmers on Egley at that time, and they spread out around and they had their families. I live up the Moist Willaura Road. I'm Harry's son. I've done a lot of work in the Willaura area for the last 50 odd years. I've been a shearer, a general contractor and a share farmer. I'm still working at 80 odd years old, and our parents have been all in this area. They've been some of the oldest people around this area. And Joyce and I, we got married in 1960. We were 55 years married last week. We've had a pretty good life. We've got 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Gary, he's just the youngest. Sue's the middle one. And Brian's the eldest. He works at Gason's. Gary's got his own transports, and Sue works at the RTA in Melbourne. We've lived in this area. I've been well known around here. They used to call me Mocker. A lot of people didn't know me as any other. Willaura's been a great area to this area, to us families, and it's been a good place to live in, and we've found the people very generous with work and one thing or another. It's been a great day to come down and do this. I've got other work to do, but I made it a special trip for the day. And over the years, I didn't go to the war. I worked for Prestige, and then I went on from there into shearing. And I went to school in Moyston years ago, and little did I know, I sang a song there, shearing sheep in New South Wales as hard as Wales. I didn't think I'd be a shearer at those times, but I shore for 52 years in this area. And New South Wales plus New Zealand. It was a very great country, New Zealand, and travel is a great experience in my life. I wish I could have done more, but life things weren't meant to go that way. But I haven't got much more. I could say a lot more, but I'm not much of this sort of thing. So I'd like to thank everybody for here today.
Jim Walter. Tammy Fraser and I were both born under Dr. Kecky's hand over here, along with a lot of others here, I think. If you drive past Mocker's place at the moment, watch out for blemmin' kangaroos, because they're everywhere. Anyway, and I was taught by Merle too when I was, I think, grade 4 probably, and I can add 2 and 2 and a few other things, so thanks for that. Appreciate that very much, as a lot of people do, I think. Just a few things. I remember when I was probably 8 to 10 anyway, like a lot of kids again around here, driving the truck for carting sheaf hay, probably first of all. You could barely reach the pedals, and it was always a bit of a problem that you had a kangaroo hop or two in the process, and that would, of course, induce all sorts of foreign language from the top of the truck, loading the truck. But what I really wanted to do was ask some of the agricultural gurus to reflect on, the old practice of like green manure, like ploughing in green crops and things like that to enrich the soil, as against this no-till sort of idea. Be just interesting to hear the reflections on and again, the whole chemical thing is a bit of an issue, I guess, and whether that's going to become a problem in the future. I'd like to hear someone reflect a bit more on that, if that's possible, whoever the gurus are.
It's probably a fairly fashionable question, the use of chemicals in farming, and I realise, but there was many a scientific study. Without the advent of modern technology, we'd have to eliminate probably 8 billion people, because without the modern technology we now use, our productivity would be only a tenth, and so that's the dilemma the reality we have to face. In doing it the old way? Well, the old way, if you go back through the records, the old way, the production was probably only a quarter of what we're doing today. And that's the harsh reality. So, as much as we all like to be green, the reality is we have too many people on the planet. And it's just not possible.
Lois Brain. I'll just add a few things that I can remember from Chris's parents and so on, and perhaps other people might have memories, but there is video footage of planes flying in and spraying oat crops. This would be back in the 1950s, and they were spraying them, I believe, with DDT. And we've got film of Ray Brain guiding them in somewhere over on the Moyston Road, I believe, perhaps Wheelers, and guiding them in with no protection, nothing, and the planes coming down low and dropping some sort of something, which I believe in those times could have been the DDT. Other people may have memories or stories about it, but it's always interested me, worried me, that the use of chemicals in those times, and I think we're a lot more aware of how careful we have to be. So yeah, if anyone has any stories of that.
Yeah, Jeff Spittle, just elaborating on what Lois said. Yes, I think probably many of the older farmers here today have stood at the end of a crop and had to duck and get covered with the DDT. I remember one year perhaps trying to not use the expense of a plane to spray the crop just before harvest to kill the grubs, and we bought a mister, and mister holds about probably 200 litres of water or so, and you put the DDT in, but it needs mixing up. I can remember putting my hand in the DDT and mixing it up, and it's just again with chemicals getting covered in arsenical sheep dip when we're dipping sheep. Well, fortunately I'm still there. And just going back to the conservation tillage, because of the dry seasons now, if we use the old-fashioned practices of working the soil up, it takes a lot of moisture out of the soil. By using direct drilling, we're actually it helps conserve the moisture in the subsoil, and this is one of the reasons why we're getting much better yields. We're conserving that moisture, which we really need, particularly this year.
Yeah, Joanna's going to speak on the immigration question.
I'm Johanna Allman, and I came to Willaura in 1957. A gentleman called Mr. Molly came to the immigration camp where we were living and brought my parents and myself, my brother, to Willaura to work for him. When I went to school, there were 6 different languages spoken in the Willaura school. It was a big wake-up call. Amsterdam, Willaura. No sewage in Willaura at that time. Sitting in the toilet, Mr. came and got the pan from under you. It was a big wake-up call. It was the best years of my life. I was allowed to be a child here. I enjoyed everything, the football, tennis, everything. It was a great place to grow up. My dad bought the vegetable farm that was at the end of Warrenook Street that used to belong to the Chinaman. I don't know if anyone remembers that. He built his own house here, and this was a man who was a fitter and a turner and a blacksmith, so he didn't know anything about building or gardening. It was a great time to grow up, and it was a great town to grow up in, and that's why after 60 years I've come back to live here and probably die here, and I just wish that a lot of more people were as enthusiastic about this town as what I am, because, you know, people today should really be able to grow up in safety and in good health.
Rolly Patterson. I just thought it may be of interest, a little history, when in my grandfather Austin Patterson and Uncle Urban Gwynn bought a slice of land from the Menina in 1912. Willaura was the largest wheat receivable town in Victoria, and the railway line was just coming through Maroona, and it was, we've still got the original brochure there with all the yields on it, and it was sold as a wheat producing property. Menina at that stage was 16 and a bit thousand acres, owned by Hans Urban, who also owned Seppels. So he was a politician and a bachelor, and that property was then divided up. Fortunate enough to be part of that estate. So I just thought that might be worth putting on the record.
Thanks, Rolly. We do have Trevor Link, our local bank manager here, and some of you have mentioned already there was 4 banks or whatever in Willaura. Can someone talk about what banking was like when they were children and how the banks operated then?
Yeah, Robert Lister. I can remember at primary school we did have a school bank, and I think it was at the State Savings Bank, which used to be across just near the railway station, I think it was. Just near Hoppy's old shop, yeah, that's right, and the Simmons's Cafe. Yeah, we used the school bank and used to, whatever you had, you know, whether it was threepence or penny or a shilling to put in your bank once a week, and we all had those little bank books. I always remember a little tin money box they used to give you as well. Primary school, Mrs. Merle, you might be able to remember the little primary school we used to have the banking. Yeah, that's about all I can remember about the bank at Willaura, but there was 4 banks here, of course, yeah. Just while I got here, I do remember after school and on weekends, I used to get a bit of pocket money. I used to work out here at Leach Fields out the egg farm. And, on the Saturday and Sunday, Johnny Brakenshaw used to come and pick me up at 7 o'clock Saturday morning, and I'd work all day out there, and on the Saturday and the Sunday for the 2 days, I'd collect 6,000 eggs, all by hand. And it's all changed now, of course, to that egg game. That's all done with machines. But yeah, that was a good experience, and I used to do that for $10 for the weekend. So it wasn't bad money like when you were still going to school.
Thanks, Robert.
Robin Biggin, when you're talking about banking, I married and came to Willaura in 1971, and I worked at the State Savings Bank. I came from Ballarat, and previous to that, there'd been a manager and a junior, and there was a problem they couldn't get a junior, so I was offered the job with 6 years' experience to come to Willaura, which was completely manual at that stage, except for a hand-cranked adding machine. So the books, the ledgers, everything was done by hand, and if you made a mistake, well, that was too bad. It didn't show up like it does on a computer now. I enjoyed that. In that stage, there was no equal pay for the girls. You worked the interest with a chart, and that was all manually done. Willaura at that stage the banking was a bit divided. The State Savings Bank had the school banks and the little district school banks, and there were a lot of wage earners in the town and on the stations, and they'd come in on Fridays, mostly Fridays, to pick up their money for the weekend, etc., because it was a cash society then. And yes, Fridays you couldn't move in the street. Everybody was in to buy their groceries, get their money, socialise in the street. You couldn't get a park. The ladies wore their hats and gloves. They were all dressed up. And I worked there for probably 18 months till I waddled out the door before I had my first child. And that was an interesting experience. There was no trading bank. It was the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney. They had about 8 employees, and that was the trading bank. If you're a farmer or you needed an overdraft, that's where you went, because the State Bank was just basically catered for the wage earners that had house loans and cheque accounts, but there were no overdrafts. 12 years later, I was offered a job back at, well, the CBC had then changed and it was amalgamated, it was the National Australia Bank. They needed, the Glen Thompson branch had closed, they needed a manual teller down there 2 half days a week, keep an agency open. So I would work at Willaura in the mornings on the computers, it was 2 extremes. And then in the afternoon I'd go down to Glen Thompson and we serviced all the little clubs and societies like you do, money for the football club, went to the pub and took change there, went to the brickworks and did wages, etc. there. So I saw the sort of full spectrum of banking from the manual to the electronics, the start of the electronics. So there you go, that was my memories of banking in Willaura.
Now, I'm going to tell some Merle Brain again. I'm going to tell some stories about myself, talking about the school state savings bank accounts, and the children would bring in their pennies and their threepences and their sixpences each week. Well, the day of that, I always took some extra change to school because I could never balance the amount that was in the book, I'd entered in the books with what I had in the bag. So no, it never seemed to balance. And with other banking, well, being farming, as their income came in once or twice a year. They had an income if they sold crop and an income from their wool, so that went in. And everything, you just had a bank book and no big sheets and sheets and sheets of daily or whatever your transactions, you know, and they just enter it in the bank book. And I suppose the farmer's wife, you ran accounts everywhere, so you never sort of handled cash much, you know, you just booked it up and at the end of the month you wrote out, or you wrote out a cheque. If you went to Ararat shopping, everybody would take a cheque from you. If you went to Ballarat, you could use your cheque. So, you know, it was none of these credit cards, which I blame for our country being in such a big debt, because everybody's encouraged by the banks who make money out of it to spend more than what they earn. So that's the worst thing I think that ever came into the country. And one of my biggest shocks when I went to Ararat to live a couple of years ago was that it doesn't matter how much cash I take out, I never seem to have any money in my purse, because I don't, you know. Because every time, you know, you go down the street and I don't know, you think, oh, I've got $50, but you open your purse and, you know. That was one of my biggest shocks from running accounts up until then. I still until actually sort of pulling this cash out of your purse every time you want to buy a piece of PK chewing gum or something, that I'm just always broke.
So the kids have arrived from the school, so I thought now is a really good moment to maybe break for a cuppa. And then the kids are obviously going to be here. I'm sure they'll have questions for you, and there's all of the information table and things like that. So, but before we break this circle, if you did speak this morning, I actually need to grab your name and signature for permission to actually replicate this recording that we've made this morning. So if you have spoken this morning, if you could just remain seated and this will just go around. How about we welcome the kids? Hey kids, morning.
We'll have a very quick cuppa, and in 5 or 10 minutes we'll come and sit back and the children will be sitting here as well. Thank you.